on our last Sunday afternoon of each month. Today we come to Psalm 93. Psalm 93. Psalm 93 is a short psalm. It is a psalm most likely written by David. It is a psalm most likely used in their public worship assembly. It may have been a psalm that was sung along with the previous song, Psalm 92, based upon the message, based upon the length. But of course we don't necessarily know, and those are just tidbits of information that have no bearing on the meaning, but are just interesting thoughts as to how these psalms may have been used. The most important aspect of the psalm, obviously, is it's inspired of God, and we can find some blessing and some hope in these words. The psalm begins, "The Lord reigneth, he is clothed with majesty. The Lord is clothed with strength, wherewith he hath girded himself. The world also is established that it cannot be moved." The Lord reigns. The psalm begins by pointing out that God is in control, God is in charge, God is over all things. Based on some of the wording of the psalm as we go forward, it may have been that this psalm was written during a time of turmoil, a time of discouragement, if you will, a time of when enemies were round about. We don't necessarily know the exact timing of the writing or the events that may have led up to the writing. But the psalmist begins by encouraging the audience that no matter what you hear, no matter what we see from this point on, God reigns. And God stands firm. And I think that's basically the message of this psalm, that no matter what we're confronted with, or what we're dealing with now, or what we may see or hear, God reigns. And he starts the psalm that way. The Lord reigneth. And the Lord reigns and continues to reign, in other words, no matter what happens. And then the interesting wording here, that God is clothed. Obviously, God is not physical. He is spiritual in nature. But he shows forth characteristics that may show him to be royal, to be majestic, clothed in majesty. The word majesty here literally means to be placed in a place of loftiness. He is very high up. In that sense, he is obviously majestic, but he is above all things. The Lord is clothed with strength. If you're dealing with discouragement, if you're dealing with enemies, if you're dealing with problems, obviously strength is something that you need. Strength is something that you want to be reminded of. And when you need help, obviously you want to go to somewhere where there is a source of strength. He hath girded himself. You might remember that the Apostle Peter told the early Christians to gird the loins of their mind, to prepare themselves, in other words, for the battle that they were about to be engaged in a spiritual sense. The Orientals, and the time that these individuals would have lived, and even into the first century, they wore long flowing robes primarily. And in order for them to go to work, in order for them to play sports, in order for them to go to battle, to go to war, they would actually lift up the garment up above the knee or around the knee so that their knees would be free to run. And in order to get that garment off the ground and not hinder their ankles and their knees so that they could run freely, they would take a sash or a belt and gird up that garment. And so when Peter told the Christians to gird up the loins of their mind, he was saying, prepare your minds for spiritual battle, for spiritual use, for work. And so here the idea is that God girds himself. That God is prepared, in other words. God is ready. God is never found not ready. He's never caught off guard, if you will. Sometimes we are caught off guard. God is never caught off guard. He's always ready. The world also is established that it cannot be moved. And that goes along with that idea that God is ready. No matter what you come at him with, no matter how hard you come at him, no matter if you come at him at day or night, he's not going to be moved. God is firm. He is established. And what he has created, that he has created to continue, will continue. Okay? So that's how the psalm begins, with quite a bit of information, right? And then he says, thy throne is established of old, thou art from everlasting, pointing out once again that God's seen it all. And they've come at him, his enemies have come at him, and no matter how often they have come at him or at what time they've come at him, he's still there, and he always will be. Once again, an encouragement to people who may have been in need of some encouragement, or may have been in need of knowing that they need a rock, a fortress, someone to guard them and guide them. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. I led the song, Count Your Many Blessings, and in that song we read of the when upon life's billows you are tempest tossed. Now this verse may be a reference to that. It may be an analogy or figurative. These floods, these waves, the flood here literally means a river that has flown outside its banks. It's a roaring river, powerful water. And they've lifted up, and they've lifted up their voice, and they've lifted up their waves. In other words, this river is as strong as it can get, and it's at its strongest. And it's coming at us. Now, it may be the case that the psalmist meant this literally, that he saw the power of the rivers and the power of the waters. And if you go up into the mountains where there's no horns honking and not many cars, just listen to the river. It's beautiful. I love to listen to water. I love to listen to water flow. But when it comes a flood, those water the tone of the river changes, doesn't it? The sound is different. It's as if the river's angry. It's mad. It's faster. It's louder. It's harder. It's rougher, right? And so it may be the case that the psalmist was watching this and said, you know, if the river's calm, if the river's come at us in a flood, it doesn't matter how hard this river beats upon the bank. These rocks are still going to be here. God's like the rock. The rivers can come and bash against the rock. It can bring its waves. It can bring its strongest waves. It can bring the strongest tide. If it's an ocean, you know, I've never seen it because I've never been to the Pacific. But in the Pacific, you know, they have these large, steep, rocky banks, and the waters just crash on them. And if you were on those rocks, you'd be in trouble, because the water just beats on those rocks and crashes. But you know, those rocks are still there. And it doesn't matter how tempestuous or hard those waves hit, but it's mean. Those waves hit mean and angry on those rocks. And so it may be literal that the psalmist saw the power of the waters and said, God's like the rock, and whatever comes at him is like those waves. Or it may be figurative in a sense that there were enemies that were rising up like the river. And they were coming at, whatever it is, I think we get the point, don't we? That when whatever comes at us, we have to deal with it, and we can deal with it, because if we're on God's side and God's on our side, God can't be moved. God's like the rock. The waves can hit him, beat him, crash on him. No matter what enemy comes at him, he's going to stand firm. If we're with him, we're going to be safe. And I think that's the whole point. And so the floods can rise, they can get loud, they can crash, and they can beat. But the Lord remains where He is. Then verse 4, the Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters. So that goes, it doesn't matter how loud the river is, God created the river. Right? And you'll remember, not only can the river not hurt God or any enemy hurt God, because God is higher than they are. He's higher than they are because He created it, right? So in Mark 4, you'll remember, Jesus is in a ship. The waves are crashing round about. He comes to he's awakened. He comes to the top of the ship, and He rebukes the wind, Mark 4 verse 39, and He says, "Peace be still. Peace be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. I think you might put a cross-reference between this verse and Psalm 93 here. The waves, the winds, they can't hurt God. God created them. He's their boss. He's in charge. And the enemies of God can't hurt Him because God created all people. And so the people, obviously there in Mark chapter 4, verse 40, He said unto them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said one to another, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey Him?" Well, what manner of man is He? He's God. And the waves, the floods can lift up, but they can't move God. The Lord on high is mightier than they. He's their creator. He's in charge. Yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. Thy testimonies are very sure. Holiness becometh thine house, O Lord, forever. Thy testimonies are very sure. Every time God said He was going to do something, He did it. Every time He made a promise, He fulfilled it. Every time that an enemy came up against God, God won. Every time that He told the people to do something and they could be saved, they were saved. His testimonies are sure. So what with all this in mind, that the Lord reigns, that there's nothing higher than God, that when God says something, it's sure, what should be our response? And the response is, holiness becometh thine house. When you come to the Lord's house, you better respect Him. I think that's what the psalmist is saying. When you come before God, you need to know who He is. You need to revere Him. You need to respect Him. He's higher than the mountains. He's higher than the seas. He's higher than the waves. He's more powerful than any. He created all. And so when you come to the house of the Lord, you need to remember all these things and treat Him with that respect. And of course, that's a principle that applies today, isn't it? That when we come before God, we need to respect Him and show proper reverence for Him. And we show proper reverence for God when we don't go beyond what He says, when we don't make what He says stricter than what He says, when we simply do what He says, when we don't seek to do our own will but do His will, when we give Him the glory and the honor and not seek to give ourselves honor or glory, then we praise God, we revere God, and holiness becomes His house. His house is worthy of holiness. Holiness means to be set apart or sanctified. And as we talked about in this morning's sermon, each member has a responsibility for the whole house to be clean. Each individual needs to be clean for the whole to be clean. And so we need to be holy and come together and worship Him and be reverent towards Him as holy because of all these things. And then, of course, He ends forever. O Lord, forever. Because God is eternal. God is always there. And God has never failed. So for a short psalm, word-wise, there's a lot there, isn't there? There's a lot of meat there, a lot of material. And I hope it's been very beneficial for you. Hopefully as encouraging to you as it was encouraging to the audience that heard it the first time and sang it. And let us remember to give God the glory and revere Him and treat Him with the reverence that He deserves.